Hello, time for another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is Animal Farm by George Orwell, originally published in 1945. This edition by Signet Classics was published in 1996. It's 140 pages. George Orwell was the pen name of Eric Blair, a British journalist and political writer who was born in 1903 and who died in 1950 of tuberculosis. Although primarily a journalist, Blair, or George Orwell, wrote 6 novels, the most famous of which are this one, Animal Farm, and his final novel, 1984, which is a dystopian novel in which the world is controlled by a handful of brutal totalitarian dictators. And it's particularly one dictator named Big Brother, who uses constant surveillance, terror techniques, and brainwashing to control everyone around him. Of course, that's a commentary on the Cold War and the totalitarian techniques of Joseph Stalin. Well, this book, Animal Farm, is much simpler and shorter than in 1984, and it's undoubtedly the most read of Orwell's books because it's often assigned reading in a lot of high school classes, and it's easy to see why, because it's a short book. Depending on the format, it's usually somewhere between 120 and 150 pages. So it's a pretty short book, and it's pretty easy to understand. It's an allegory, and it's a satire about Stalinism. In fact, the original title was Animal Farm, a Fairy Tale. So in an allegory, you have characters that represent other ideas or people. In this case, the animal farm itself represents the Soviet Union. So to get into the plot just a little bit, Animal Farm starts out as a farm in England called Manor Farm, and it's run by an alcoholic aging farmer named Mr. Jones, who neglects the animals and he doesn't feed them enough and overworks them and so forth. He, of course, represents the Tsar and all the aristocrats around him who ruled Russia up until the Bolshevik Revolution. There's an older hog on the farm named Old Major who represents Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, and he gives these stirring speeches where he stirs up all the other animals and says we need to overthrow Mr. Jones and kick him out and take over and run the farm ourselves, an animal farm for animals, and he's successful. They're able to rise up and boot Mr. Jones out. So he goes into exile. It's, of course, all the white Russian aristocrats who went in exile. And when Mr. Jones organizes an attack on the farm, which represents the Russian Civil War, Old Major and the animals are able to fight them off. And so for a while there, everything looks like it's going great. The animals take control of the farm. They have more food. They're not worked as much and so forth. So everything looks like it's going pretty well. But then Old Major dies, and there are 2 other hogs that take over. One is named Snowball, who represents Leon Trotsky, and the other one is named Napoleon, who represents Joseph Stalin. And they soon come to a conflict about how they want the farm to be ran. Of course, Trotsky wanted to spread communism throughout the world. He wanted to send Russian agents everywhere to try to promote world revolution. And Stalin wanted to modernize Russia and make it a world power. And he didn't want to start wars all over the place. He wanted to concentrate on building up Russia. Before he was committed to Marxism, but he didn't want to spread global revolution. He wanted to cooperate where he could with the capitalist countries around him. And so in the novel, Napoleon is able to chase Snowball off the farm that represents Trotsky's exile, and then he becomes the sole controller of the animal farm. And he gets a bunch of young dogs and trains them to be guard dogs, and so they're his bodyguards, and they're constantly around him, and if anyone questions him, he sicks the dogs on them. He also makes an alliance with a hog named Squealer, who represents the propaganda department of the Communist Party, organizations like Pravda and the radio stations and everything that put out propaganda. And the most famous line in Animal Farm is the line, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. And Squealer repeats this so often that the sheep, who represent the kind of ignorant peasant class, start vowing that every time something comes up. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, anytime something happens. So they're completely brainwashed. They're completely under the influence of Napoleon. And Napoleon always tells them, things were so much worse when the humans were in charge of this farm. So if you complain about this, they're better. And so they brainwashes everyone into that. Now, there's some other characters that pop up in this allegory. At one point, Napoleon makes an uneasy alliance with another farmer named Mr. Frederick, who is Adolf Hitler. And, of course, that's the secret agreement they had to split up Poland. And, and eventually, everything works okay for a while. But then Napoleon realizes that Mr. Frederick is cheating him. And then eventually Mr. Frederick gets a coalition of other farmers, and they attack Animal Farm and try to take it over and kill Napoleon. And they fail. There's this huge bloody battle. A whole bunch of animals are killed. The farmers are killed and so forth. Of course, that's World War II. Eventually, Napoleon is successful, but at a huge, huge cost. Right? There's a raven named Moses who represents the Russian Orthodox Church. At first, Raven leaves, but then he comes back. And he starts preaching sermons, telling the animals that, you may have a terrible life here, but when you die, you'll be in heaven. There'll be a paradise waiting for you. The suffering on earth guarantees that you're going to have a paradise. And Napoleon wisely lets Raven go on and stay there because he realizes that religion is keeping these animals from rebelling against him, against Napoleon. So that's the whole religion is the opiate of the masses thing that Marx said. So he represents that. And then finally there's a donkey, an old donkey named Benjamin, who represents the intellectuals in Russia. And he knows what's going on. He's aware that they're actually worse off now than they were under Mr. Jones. But he also knows that if he's not careful, he'll be killed, or sold off to another farm. And so he's very cautious about what he says. And he's also very cynical and fatalistic, like a lot of Russian intellectuals are. He basically says, well, our lives, we're doomed to suffer. Our country's doomed. Our farm is doomed to always have terrible leadership. No matter what happens, we're always going to be exploited and so forth. Anyway, at the end, there's a big celebration after they've defeated Mr. Frederick and so forth. And one of the positive things about Napoleon is he does modernize the farm. He puts in a windmill, which brings in money, but instead of spending the money to improve the farm and help the other animals, he spends it all on alcohol. He and the other pigs throw big parties and get drunk and celebrate. And at the very end, they have a big party to kind of celebrate the end of the war. And he invites some of the other farmers in who are more sympathetic to them. And they have a big card game together. He and the pigs and the humans get together and have a card game, a poker game. And it becomes clear the other animals are off in the distance watching this. And they realize that both sides are cheating. Both the humans and the pigs are cheating each other. And that's when they realize that it doesn't matter that they've been duped. The pigs are just as bad as the humans. They're just as exploitive. The communists are just as exploitive as the capitalists are. We're screwed around, whatever happens. So even though there's comical moments to it, it's essentially a dark story. All of Orwell's books are rather grim, kind of a pessimistic outview of life. Now, the thing about Eric Blair, or George Orwell, is he was a leftist from the very beginning. He was a committed communist and was thrilled when the Bolsheviks took over Russia. And he was so committed to the cause of Marxism that he actually went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s and fought on the loyalist side and was shot in the neck by a sniper and somehow survived. They never completely recovered from his injuries. But so he was really devoted to the cause. But then when word got out about all the atrocities Stalin was committing, the mass murders, the giant prison camps, the deliberate starvation of the Ukrainians, he turned against Stalin. This book was published, as I said, in 1945 while the war was still going on. And he wrote it in 1943 and 1944. And it took a lot of guts for Orwell to write a book like this because during the war, the Soviet Union was an ally both of the United States and Great Britain. And he faced a lot of opposition when he tried to get this book published. There were multiple attempts to censor the book or actually ban it from being published. But after the war, when the Cold War began and the Soviet Union suddenly became the enemy of the West, Animal Farm became very popular. It sold very well. And in fact, during the 1950s, the CIA actually sponsored a secret program where they flew weather balloons into Eastern Europe that had boxes of Animal Farm books that they dropped in Eastern European countries, hoping that people would pick up the books. They had it translated into Polish and Hungarian and so forth, and they airlifted these books into Eastern Europe, hoping that people would read them. So the attitude changed. Now, Animal Farm is a good book, but it doesn't have the depth or the complexity of 1984. 1984 is certainly Orwell's masterpiece. And of course, Animal Farm is not as relevant as 1984 because Stalin is long since dead. The Soviet Union no longer exists. And communism as a philosophy, as an economic concept, has been discredited. Even the Communist Party in China no longer practices Marxism. They're just as capitalist as the West are, except they're a totalitarian government, but they're still buying and selling, and they have stocks and everything else. So in some sense, this is a very dated book. But it's still important as a historical document because it shows you what was going on, the kind of brainwashing techniques that you still see in North Korea, and the terrible way. What starts out as an idealistic egalitarian movement becomes hijacked by gangsters who use the party apparatus to put themselves in power and enrich themselves and so forth. So it serves as a warning to anyone who kind of falls in love with a totalitarian leader who, promises the world and things are going to be better, and then when they get in power, they turn the country into a police state and take away people's rights and freedoms, and everything becomes worse. So even though in some ways it's dated, it's still worth reading. If you haven't read anything by George Orwell, this is probably the place to start with because, again, it's a fairly simple to understand book, and it's really short, doesn't take long to read. But you should read at some point 1984, and especially you should read some of Orwell's essays. He was primarily a journalist, and I think he's a better nonfiction writer than he is a novelist. His novels are okay. They're certainly important for their ideas, but he wasn't a great prose stylist. But his nonfiction essays are really excellent. Many of them are very, very relevant for today. I would especially recommend that you read an essay called Why I Write and another one called Notes on Nationalism. So if you can get a chance to read some of Orwell's essays, essay collections, or nonfiction pieces, you should definitely do that. But Animal Farm is a good place to start. The book is Animal Farm. The author is George Orwell. This has been another Man and Gray book review. Thanks for watching.